Hey, thanks, folks. So I'm Remi Kalir, and as I begin today, I want to introduce you to a few characters. And the first is that guy. That's Maimonides. He was a 12th century Sephardic rabbi. He lived in Morocco and in Egypt and was a real eminent philosopher and legal scholar. Now, in addition to him, I also want to probably familiarize not many folks in the room because you probably already know who does this. It's Banksy. We might not know what Banksy looks like, but his art, his activism, his kind of counter-narrative is really an annotation of our physical built environment. Now, in addition to these two folks, I also want to introduce you, perhaps, to Alexandra El Botkin. She's a Kazakhstani computer programmer, neuroscientist. She created Sci-Hub and made available over 58 million academic papers via this website. Now, why am I introducing us to El Botkin and to Banksy and to Maimonides? Because I believe, Barry, that they've got something to tell us about web annotation. Now, before I get into the specifics, check out the slides and the resources via my website. It's bit.ly/Remi times DML. So here we go. First chapter. Let's talk about knowledge. Let's talk about how knowledge is constructed and how it's contested. Maimonides was one of many authors of the Talmud, a Hebrew text, a legal text, where multiple authors are essentially arguing with each other, creating a layered discourse in this document. Now today, we're using tools perhaps like Hypothesis, a web annotation platform that allows for multiple authors to have conversations. It's inspired by Vannevar Bush. He had this Memex idea in the 30s about really augmenting our memory. Well, today, web annotation looks like climate scientists who are essentially peer reviewing the news. They're finding ways to say the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, what they're publishing about climate is factually accurate. They're adding expert knowledge onto the news. Web annotation, it's been around for quite a while. It's not new. It was really baked into the initial coding of the web. Mosaic, the first web browser, had annotation built into it. Today, though, we can all kind of mimic Maimonides by using open source free platforms like Hypothesis to add our voices to conversations. All right, chapter 2, critique. Let's talk about how we might create our own counter-narratives and push back against everyday contexts, and how we might think of that for academics, for youth, and certainly for educators. Academics are often reading things online that might be perhaps provocative, talking about the academy. We might find ways of saying, wait a second, where's our agency in these conversations about higher ed? How can we comment on that using conversation in the margin to advance our own agendas? Certainly youth, like the Youth Voices Project, where youth are authoring blogs and providing feedback to their peers via web annotation. It's a great way to use writing and social reading to craft learning pathways. And for educators, for both K-12 and higher ed folks, there are a number of projects where educators can think critically about the relations of society, schooling, and equity, and have conversations that are professionally relevant. Okay, third chapter. Let's also talk about access. Let's talk about how we can think of, this Sci-Hub website as removing barriers to scientific knowledge, and how web annotation begins to remove some barriers to communication, making our web perhaps more participatory, perhaps even more egalitarian. And we can see, for example, out to my colleague, Chris Gilliard. He studies IT policy in K-12 and higher ed. He talks about digital redlining and the way that information is not accessible to various people based upon policy. And there are some amazing annotations on that article. You should check it out. We should also think about data systems and how when we do have access, greater accessibility to open data systems, can we annotate that data, adding metadata, pointing out what data might be missing, and thinking perhaps critically about how to direct our analysis of a given data set. Lastly, I want to point out that Hypothesis is open source. You can fork their code on GitHub. It's interoperable. It's aligned to the standards of the W3C. Great accessibility from kind of an organizational standpoint. Ultimately, in conclusion, I want to argue that web annotation is about the con. In this case, though, it's about conversation. It's about constructing knowledge. It's about being contrarian and certainly being consequential. I have a feeling that he would have really dug web annotation. It's also, of course, about text. Text first as a noun, as a thing, as word that we add to document, but also text as a verb, as activity, as action, as creating teaching and learning opportunities. Ultimately, web annotation creates contexts. It creates environments for teaching and learning, but they don't look like that. They're not linear, they're not prescribed, they're messy, they're divergent, they're bringing in multiple voices. We can think of web annotation fundamentally as kind of like a hybrid practice, one that blends formal with informal learning, one that stretches conversation across settings and contexts. And for folks in this room who care about messing around and geeking out, web annotation is a great place to start. Thank you so much.